And I say this because over the last couple of days since Saturday, I've seen a lot on social media and on traditional media attempts to explain, justify what Hamas was doing. Let's be clear. I know we're going to talk about policy. We need to talk about policy and all of that, but let's be very clear. What happened was terrorism. There is no other way to describe it. What happened, the heinous scenes that we have seen cannot be justified. Nothing justify them. We need to have that moral clarity as we approach this issue. Of course, we need to talk about policy issues, the conduct of the Israeli response, etc. But at the foundation of it is an immoral act taken by a terrorist organization intentionally hitting civilians for political gain. This we have to be very clear about. Now, what I will try to do today is to really talk a bit more about Hamas, what it is, what our objective is, its objective is, both from this operation and large and in the bigger picture, a bit about what they're hoping to do in the West Bank arena in particular, and maybe conclude with a couple of notes for the policy recommendations for the administration. So what is Hamas? Hamas is, Palestinian society, like every other Arab society, has always had a component that is Islamist, that is a believer in the Muslim Brotherhood approach to Islamism. Yet, traditionally, the Islamists in the Palestinian arena really remained outside the nationalist, outside the, if you wish, the liberation struggle. They were doing religious work, charity, etc. This changed in 1987. In 1987, with the first intifada has just started, the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine decided that they need to create their own organization that will get involved in this dynamic, and Hamas was created. Hamas is an acronym that stands for the Islamic Resistance Movement. Interestingly, the word Palestine does not appear on it because they always saw themselves as something bigger than simply Palestine. Initially, in the 1980s, Hamas was really an irritant. I said, of course, a violent irritant, a bloody irritant, but it was not seen as a strategic threat. This changed with the Oslo Accords. With the Oslo Accords, that was the chance for Hamas to distinguish itself when the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, bought into the idea of diplomacy and a two-state solution. This was the opportunity for Hamas to start distinguishing itself. It came very strong in opposition to Oslo, in opposition to any kind of accommodation with Israel, and a renewed commitment to violence and terror. This played out in much of the 1990s with catastrophic events after the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in Israel, where Hamas engaged in a number of suicide bombings that arguably shaped the trajectory of both Oslo and Israeli politics. But Hamas's real rise to prominence happened in the Second Intifada. In the Second Intifada, with the resort to terror and violence as a way of dealing with Israel, no one could compete with Hamas. Terror, violence is what Hamas does and what it does well. And when Fatah, rather, the main secular movement started adopting some of Hamas's own terror tactics, Hamas's paradigm got validated. Long story short, by 2006, as the Intifada was ending, the Palestinian Authority called for an election. Hamas ran in this election. Hamas was very smart, realizing that the Palestinian public at that point was still scarred from the violence in the Intifada, did not run on a terror platform, though they never renounced terror. Rather, they used the Palestinian Authority's main vulnerability, corruption, poor governance, etc., and they won the elections. A year ensued in which there were tensions between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, ended up with a civil war. In 2007, Hamas took over Gaza, and ever since, Hamas has been the governing authority in Gaza. Now, that period, and I think my colleagues talked a bit about it, was a very interesting period. Hamas used it for a number of reasons, the governance of Gaza, for a number of objectives. Part of the objective, Naomi and Matt mentioned, terror buildup, etc. But there was also a political objective. Hamas saw the idea of governing territory as a vehicle to legitimize itself in the international discourse. Hamas was presenting itself as, look, we're governing, we are moderating, deal with us as a legitimate authority. And in doing this, they were actually being supported by some of the regional supporters. We talk about Iran as a regional supporter for Hamas, and that is true. But Hamas has two other regional supporters. who support the whole Muslim Brotherhood approach, and these are Qatar and Turkey. And they were really pushing the Hamas narrative that Hamas is legitimate. They've been organizing dialogue between Hamas and different Western interlocutor. So Hamas was trying to mainstream, and they used some very clever tactics. For example, a few years ago, they came up with a new political document that they marketed as a change to their charter, which it was not, which was quite clever. They said we were willing to accept Israel, a Palestinian state on the 67 borders, yet, and the world, many in the world, focused on that part of their statement, forgot the second part. We will never accept Israel. Because the very idea of a two-state solution is one that is anathema to what Hamas stands for. Now, in its governance in Gaza, though they did get some of these diplomatic and mainstreaming benefits, they also faced some of the challenges with governance, particularly the exposure of their very nature. You know, they did win the elections in 2006, and they did convincingly. Yet, governing Gaza, it was very clear that they were as corrupt as the Palestinian Authority, that they're were as intolerant, even more intolerant than anyone else of any kind of dissent. Today, if you look at public opinion polling, Hamas is not governing by any stretch of the imagination for being popular. They are governing by force, by oppression, etc. I would recommend a series of short interviews with Gazan in the civilians living in Gaza under Hamas called Whispered in Gaza to give you a flavor of what it is like living under Hamas. Nor was Hamas the only available power in Gaza that was being. They had an interesting love-hate relation with some other factions, Palestinian Islamic Jihad being the most obvious. Yet Hamas undoubtedly is the undisputed leader in Gaza, and there is no political way to dislodge it in the short term. Now, let's move to what happened this weekend and why did Hamas do what it did. I think my colleagues mentioned some of the kind of big picture strategic objectives, derailing the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement, helping Iran and its Axis project its power, but also there were domestic political objectives of what Hamas did that relate to the Palestinian arena, whether in the West Bank or I wouldn't call it Palestinian, but within Israel itself. And let me quickly go to the Israeli part. Hamas did hope and still hopes, we're still at the very early days of these events, that we will have a repeat of what happened a few years ago when there were clashes between Hamas and Israel, and we saw intercommunal violence between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. They are hoping for that. They are hoping, frankly, that some of the members of the current Israeli government will feed those flames. I am not an expert on Israeli politics, enough to say, though, that we are seeing some very courageous voices coming from within some Israeli Arabs, particularly former, actually current member of Knesset, Mansour Abbas, who are urging towards de-escalation. But the real focus of Hamas has been on the West Bank. And for the West Bank, they have actually three objectives, interconnected objective. First, they hope that they will use the West Bank as a way of opening another front, meaning using terror attacks. So far, we have seen no successful terror attacks coming from the West Bank. Whether they will succeed or not remains to be seen. They have also been hoping to mobilize the public to stand up, basically to ignite a third intifada. And in doing this, they had actually an assessment of the situation in the West Bank. They have seen the weakness and fragility of the Palestinian Authority, and we'll get to that in a minute. And they are hoping that the anger that the public has, on the one hand, towards the Palestinian Authority, on the other hand, towards Israel, will translate into mass demonstrations. So far, this has not happened yet. Yes, the last couple of days we have seen clashes, we have seen casualties, yet we have not seen that mobilization. I would keep a close eye on what happens this coming Friday. After the Friday prayers, often is the time of heightened tension. But so far, this is not going. And part of why it's not happening is the Palestinian Authority understands these threats and is deploying, to the extent that it can, security capabilities to prevent wide-scale clashes. And the third point, which really encompasses both, is an attempt to basically lead to the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is extremely weak today. It's weak for a number of reasons. I think Naomi mentioned some of the reasons. Israeli policy in recent years has been geared really, in effect, to weaken the Palestinian Authority as it stabilized Hamas, but also it's weak because of its own domestic behavior. Corruption, poor governance, lack of political openness have created a situation where most Palestinians today, according to polls, look at the PA, the Palestinian Authority, as a liability, not an asset. For Hamas, this creates an opening to create a vacuum and then to fill the vacuum. I will conclude maybe with a couple of policy recommendations to the U.S. as it relates to U.S. Policy. It is too late, too early in the game to talk about very specific policy recommendations. Yet, I would keep two things in mind as we approach in the United States, diplomatically speaking, the next few weeks. One, no matter how this war ends, and we don't know how it's going to end. As Rob said, this is something very different from what we saw before, and many of our old assumptions will not hold true. Yet, however the war ends, we have to make sure that Hamas does not end up being able to demonstrate any win from its use of terror. There were instances in the past where previous administrations were willing to consider ceasefires that would have given Hamas certain benefits. I think it is key that we make sure that we do not do this. And part of doing this is to make sure that when the various mediators come in, that we open the space to allies in the region who agree with our objectives and not allow others who are Hamas supporters to come and lead these kinds of diplomatic efforts. Yes, we will have to deal with countries like Qatar and Turkey when it comes to issues like hostages, etc. But at the end of the day, there are allies who share our view: Egypt, Jordan, the Arab Emirates, and others, and they should be leading the regional diplomacy, and we in the United States should be supporting that.